Bonjour tout le monde. I hope everybody's belly is full. And well, I was going to say mind empty, but no, of course, we've done a lot of thinking already. But I hope you're ready for this afternoon of learning. Hein? Bonjour tout le monde. Bienvenue encore. J'espère que votre appétit est rassasié. Mais avant qu'on commence, so before we get into panelists, I just want to give everybody time to get back to it, to get back to their spaces of comfort. But while we wait for those folks, I have a bit of a trivia question for you. Earlier, I was playing another instrument that looks like that. Un instrument comme ça. And it is an instrument that has many different names. Hein? Puis ça ressort dans plusieurs cultures, so it shows up in many different cultures. So because of that, it has a huge dictionary, or I guess, of synonyms that mean the same thing. So in the chat, I'm daring you right now. Allez-y, tapez. What do you call this instrument? C'est quoi ça? Yeah, I see someone was quick on it. Jaw harp. What else do we got? I'm a little bit far here. A twanger? Yeah, very good, very good. What else we got? Mouth harp. Okay. Got a lot of different names for it. What else we got? On peut le dire en français aussi. Mouth harp, guimbarde. Très bien. Quel autre nom? And the reason I ask is a bit of a selfish thing. It's so that my interpretation gets better every time, right? Because I'll learn some new words for this same instrument I've been playing for a while. Qu'est-ce qu'on a ici là? That's a different one. Annoyance. Oh. Je m'excuse, sorry. Someone doesn't like the jig. It's okay, it's not for everyone. But yeah, very good. Up to now we've seen some great suggestions. What else we have here? We have pronounced cymbale by some relatives. Oh, very good. Ooh. I am a lame. Yeah, that's you're told. Okay. Well, we'll believe you. Very good. Some other words I've heard for it is mouth harp, jaw harp, juice harp, which you can find the Snoopy juice harp in many museum gift shops, which is a derivative of Jew's harp, which nobody wrote that one up, but it shows up even in our archives and in many places, because wherever I go, I tend to search for this, and we find it under Jew's harp more often than not, tell you the truth. But jaw harp is what it is. Harp is an Old English word which means musical instrument that you put up against your jaw. Jew's harp, well, it shows up in klezmer music. It shows up in any traveling people's kind of history. So it picked up that name there, but then it became juice harp. So let's just go back to jaw harp, right? En français, guimbarde, bombarde, trompe. These are all words we hear in Manitoba that describe this instrument. So very good. Well done, everyone. So I see most of us are back and are typing away, which means we're engaged. C'est très bien. Which means we're ready for our next set of panelists. Now, the panelist discussion is Indigenous heritage, Indigenous initiatives, and issues in heritage preservation in Manitoba. Should prove to be a very interesting panel talk. Now, Kaila Johnston is going to be our moderator. And Kaila Johnston is the Supervisor of Education, Outreach, and Public Programming at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. In this role, she oversees matters related to the support of educators, development of resources, establishment of outreach initiatives, as well as public engagement on residential schools and their legacy. Prior to the NCTR, Kaila worked with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a statement gatherer and coordinator to support statement gathering activities. She holds a BA in Criminal Justice from the University of Winnipeg and an MSc in International Crimes and Criminology from Vrije University. I don't know how to say those words, but it's in Amsterdam, so I'm guessing you might be able to enlighten us on how to say Vrije Universiteit. Am I even close? But Kaila, I'm happy to see you there with us. I'm going to let you go ahead and introduce your panelists and, well, enlighten us in every which way you can. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. And just as a quick note for the pronunciation of university, it's Vrije Universiteit, and it just means the Free University of Amsterdam. So just to add on to my introduction here, I am of mixed heritage, including Cree, Soto, Métis on my mother's side. And on my father's side, I'm Ukrainian and British Isles. I am an intergenerational survivor, which means my mother attended residential school, as did her siblings, her parents, and extended family. And just as a note, as an amateur genealogist, I use quite a lot of the services from the MHS website to the Manitoba Genealogical Society works. Now, I have been asked to moderate the following session on Indigenous initiatives and issues in heritage preservation in Manitoba. So I'm very cognizant of time. So we will spend the next 40 minutes or so with some discussion with our special guests before we move into a Q&A. Each panelist will have about 10 minutes or so, and I will gently remind them when they have 1 minute left just to make sure we are on time today. And with that, I am going to introduce our first panelist. So Warren Cariou is a writer, photographer, and professor based in Winnipeg. His work focuses on environmental philosophies and oral traditions of Indigenous peoples in Western Canada, especially as these relate to his Métis heritage. He has published works of memoir, fiction, poetry, and film, and his Buteman photography has been exhibited and published nationally. He has also edited numerous books of Indigenous literature and storytelling, and he teaches in the Department of English, Theatre, Media, and Film and Media at the University of Manitoba. So with that, I will give the stage to Warren, and your 10 minutes are started.
Thank you very much, Kaila, and thanks to everyone for being here. It's a real honor to be on a panel with such amazing thinkers and community-based activists as well. I just wanted to, I was really interested in the theme of this panel, because in a lot of ways, my work at the University of Manitoba has been focused on storytelling and on how Indigenous storytelling in particular, and how to foster storytelling as contemporary practice. That is, how to keep stories being told and being shared and being preserved for future generations as well. I worked for almost 12 years as a director of the Center for Creative Writing and Oral Culture, which is still ongoing. And I've just stepped down from that role, and Dr. Jocelyn Thorpe has taken over and is going to be doing some fantastic work there as well. But I maintain my connections and my commitments to this issue. So I guess what I wanted to talk about today, just to start off, is thinking about Indigenous storytelling, as obviously an incredibly important part of Indigenous cultural heritage, but also just thinking about the ways in which we approach the idea of, I guess, preserving knowledge, saving knowledge for the future, and sharing knowledge in the present as well. UNESCO has an interesting designation of how they divide different kinds of cultural heritage, and they talk about intangible and tangible cultural heritage. And the tangible cultural heritage, they say, is like architecture, artifacts, books, manuscripts, things like that. Intangible ones, they say, are stories, dance, other kinds of performance. And of course, stories are in some ways, that this is an interesting way to divide them when we're thinking about how stories get shared into the future. But there's some ambiguities there, and there's some things that make me a little bit uncomfortable about thinking about stories as intangible heritage, because it makes it sound like they are not real or that they are not physical. And for me, when I'm a listener to a story, or when I'm telling a story, it is very tangible. It's very much in my body. I'm feeling it. I'm having that relationship with the storyteller or with the audience that is tangible to me. So I think it's important to think about I guess the nuances and the fluidity of these kinds of designations. Things that are tangible or labeled as such, there are certain strategies for preserving those materials that are well documented, and we've had lots of really interesting discussions of archives and other historical practices already today. Intangible cultural heritage generally has, I think, different kinds of ways to preserve it. And in fact, I'm a bit uncomfortable with the idea of preserving stories, because what happens when we preserve a story is we record it and write it down, and perhaps even publish it or archive it. And that's important work, and I've done a lot of that work as well, and I enjoy doing that. But I think there's something about the told story that is different from the story that's turned into a thing that is written down or recording. And so for me, the one of the key elements, besides preserving stories by recording them or by writing them down and helping communities to do that, is to try and think about how can the stories be fostered to be still told, and told in a contemporary way. And so I like to think about story preservation on the one hand, where we record things and write them down. But I think equally important is what I call story vitalization. That is, making the stories come alive again in the present, and providing opportunities for listeners to be there to experience the live story, and for storytellers to tell those stories. And it was wonderful to see Rob Mallow opening our session and being our MC today, because he does that all the time. And I think Rob's work is a great example of story vitalization, as I'm calling it. So I want to move quickly at this point so we have time for discussion, but just to think about, how, if we were to think about vitalizing stories, Indigenous stories, how would we go about doing that? And I think there's some key aspects of doing that they are much more holistic than some other approaches might be. I think for stories to be alive in the present and shared so that they'll be shared into the future, we need to ensure that Indigenous peoples have access to their territory, to their land, in a real, meaningful, and ongoing way, because the stories are so often deeply connected to territory. And so I think that's one key element. And telling stories on the land, if you've ever had an opportunity to hear an elder or a storyteller tell on the land out in their territory, it's a really special experience. I think language revitalization is also key, so that Indigenous listeners and tellers can experience the stories in their own languages. So that is crucial as well. I think we also need to think about reassessing our education system so that there's more opportunity for storytellers to share stories, for young people to hear stories in a live experience rather than as a written down or a recorded experience. And then I guess finally, I think that one of the last things that's crucial in this regard is to think about stories as contemporary. We think of Indigenous traditional stories as being from the past, and they certainly are, and they're a deep connection to our ancestors, but they're also very much contemporary, because each time the story is told, it becomes new. And as Elder Louis Bird has told me many times, the stories are flexible, and that's a great strength of the stories. And that means that they have that flexibility to be applicable in new circumstances and to carry the teachings on into the future. So maybe I'll stop there for now, and I look forward to our further discussion. Thanks.
Wow, Warren, you blew through that. I didn't even have to give you a reminder for the 1 minute. I should say, it's wonderful to see everyone. I have had engagement with everyone on this panel really throughout my work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, with the National Center of Truth and Reconciliation, and our Decolonizing Lens series. And in fact, we actually screened some of Warren's work at one of our functions. And the next person I'm going to be inviting to come on screen and speak is Julia Lafreniere. Oh, geez. Oh, that was a mouthful. And that was even me asking prior how to properly pronounce her last name, as in our work, I've always just called her Julia. But as a quick introduction, Julia is an advocate for bringing and bridging cultural gaps and creating institutional understanding within colonial spaces. She carries teachings of love, kindness, and understanding that have been passed to her from knowledge keepers within Indigenous communities. Julia's family is from the Métis community of Camperville, located on Treaty 4 territory. She's a second generational residential day school survivor, and grew up both on Treaty 1 and on Treaty 5 territory. Currently, Julia is the head of Indigenous initiatives at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, where she has been there professionally since 2019. Julia holds an advanced Bachelor of Arts degree in Native Studies from the U of M and is currently completing a Master's in Developmental Practice at the University of Winnipeg. Her research interests include water and land protection and exploring various methods of incorporating Indigenous knowledge into colonial institutions. She has extensive community involvement, having served in a voluntary capacity on local boards, student groups, and within ceremonial spaces. And with that, I pass the mic to Julia.
Thanks, Kaila. Hello, everyone. Bonjour Inanam, Julia Lafreniere and Indigenous, Camperville Dunji. Mi papa Joe Lafreniere, Indigenous, Wagushtodam. My name is Julia Lafreniere. My family is from the Métis community of Camperville, Manitoba, as Kaila mentioned, located on Treaty 4 territory, and currently I'm the head of Indigenous initiatives at WAG Kalmayuk. So I think what I would like to talk about today would be incorporating Indigenous knowledge into colonial institutions and giving a few examples of how I've done that at the WAG. And I'd like to frame that by beginning that with saying that we can't ignore the fact that colonial institutions are systemically and structurally unwelcoming places for Indigenous folks. And I think once we acknowledge that and then begin to understand why, then we can begin the work that reconciliation requires of us. So at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, a few different projects that I'll talk a bit about. The first will be the Artworks Renaming Initiative, and then I'll touch on the importance of language, Indigenous languages, and how we are incorporating that into the galleries, and then caring for the artworks in a ceremonial way. And then I'll talk a little bit about partnerships based in reciprocity if I have time. So watch the clock. Hopefully I'll be as good as the last presenter was at monitoring my time. So starting with the Artworks Renaming Initiative. So as with many historical collecting art institutions, we have a collection of artworks that is part of the gallery. And so exhibitions are, done by trading these artworks back and forth. And the Winnipeg Art Gallery is the oldest civic art museum in Canada. So a lot of our artworks are from the 1800s and early 1900s when different terminology and words were used that are now inappropriate in today's context and racist and offensive. So some of the examples would be like the words Indian or Eskimo. We even had a couple that contained the titles savage and half-breed. So a lot of the time when people come to the gallery and they engage with a piece of art, the first thing they do is they'll read the little panel that's next to it. And that has the name of the artwork, the artist, where the work was created, and that the age of the artist. And so when people are first introduced to a piece, if it has the word like Indian or Eskimo in it, it automatically frames how you engage with that piece. And it automatically others Indigenous folks while they're engaging with that piece. So it was brought to my attention that we have works in our collection, historical works that contain these words, and we decided we had to do something about it. We have to rename these works. So what we did was we hired a researcher to work closely with the collection and to identify these works. And so she identified 57 of them that carry these inappropriate titles. And what we did was we did our best to identify the nation, the Indigenous nation that was depicted in the works based on the beadwork or the clothing style or perhaps the headdress that the person was wearing in the image. And if it wasn't a person depicted, there was a couple that were called Indian encampment, then we did our best to identify the landscape based on like the trees, or if it looked like plains or the river or some of the plants that were growing in the artwork. Then we did our best to identify the territory that it was located on. And then once we had the nation identified as best we could, we then brought in knowledge keepers from that nation to rename the artworks. Some of them decided that they were going to treat it like a naming ceremony. So they took images of the artworks back home with them and prayed about it, and then came back and then gave the artworks their name and ceremony. And this project is significant because as some of you probably know, each individual artwork has a provenance that's attached to it. It's like the history of the artwork. And that history is essentially a folder, an actual folder that contains all of the history of that artwork. If it's been repaired in any way by a preparateur, or if it's been lent to another exhibition or lent to another gallery for an exhibition, that's in there. All of the different names that maybe that artwork carried with it is contained in that provenance. And this is the first time that Indigenous knowledge has been incorporated directly into that provenance, and it will be carried with that artwork on its journey forward. Another note to mention is that all of the artworks that we selected were by non-Indigenous artists. We found some works in our collection that did contain the word Indian, but they were more contemporary, and we by Indigenous artists, and we noticed that not a lot, but some of the Indigenous artists are reclaiming those terms and using it as an act of resistance. So all of the 57 works that we renamed with this project were by non-Indigenous artists. So it was really incorporating Indigenous knowledge into the canon of art history, which has never been done at an institution to this extent in Canada before. And we got a lot of inquiries from other galleries across Canada wanting to do something similar with their collection, because as with most historical collections, it will contain words like this. And something I learned about this was that oftentimes curators will rename artworks. So when we have a piece that's called like Indian Chief or something, that isn't necessarily the original name that it came with. It can be donated to the gallery, and then the curator will see it and rename it, maybe 50 years ago or something. And so maybe 50 years, 70, 100 years down the line, these artworks will have new names given to them. So yeah, that was an example of how we are incorporating an Indigenous knowledge into the Winnipeg Art Gallery. Another example would be the use of Indigenous languages. If we think about the United Nations Declarations for the Rights of Indigenous People and the TRC's calls to action, as well as the MMIWG calls to justice, they all highlight the importance of language. And for those of us that are maybe familiar with the nuances of language, it really frames how you see the world. And the difference between Indigenous language and Anishinaabe-Moan, which I've had the the privilege of learning a little bit about, is that it is structured completely differently. And it's hard to explain in English. Maybe somebody else, maybe Dené would be better at explaining that difference, but it really frames how you see the world. And so incorporating Indigenous language into colonial institutions is a way that we can bring that knowledge and that worldview and that way of seeing the world into the space to take up as much space as possible. So when we have a didactic in our galleries, and the didactic is usually a few paragraphs explaining what the exhibition is about, we'll always translate it into the language of the artist or the language of the curators. So for example, we have an exhibition right now that I co-curated by artist Tracy Fair, who is Michif. And so we translated the didactic into Michif and it takes up equal amount of space as the English version on the gallery wall. And
Hey, Julia,
yeah,
you have a few minutes left.
Okay. So naming spaces. Yeah, maybe we'll talk about partnerships based in reciprocity just quickly. So most of the work that I do, it weighs heavily, I guess, because I'm advocating not just for a group of people, but for like my community and my family. So I've developed relationships with different knowledge keepers and elders in the community. And it really supports the work that I do and supports the institution as a whole. So I would really encourage people from all walks of life and all works that you do to develop these relationships with knowledge keepers in the Indigenous community to help support the work that you do. Miigwech.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Julia. It's always a pleasure to work with you and the WAG when we do all of our amazing screenings. And with that, I am going to introduce our next panelist. Dené Sinclair is Ojibwe Anishinaabe Kwe from the St. Peter's Band, Selkirk, Manitoba, and a member of Peguis First Nation. She is an award-winning leader and advocate for Indigenous-led business, heritage, and development, and now runs a successful consulting business in Winnipeg. Dené is a committed learner of Anishinaabe Mowin and proudly gives back to her community through volunteer work on several boards and committees. She's an artist and creator and spends as much of her time in her studio as she can. Dené is part of the management team at the Manitoba Indigenous Cultural Education Center, serving as their business advisor and providing strategic development direction as the MICEC grows and expands. The MICEC is Manitoba's largest cultural education center and welcomes anyone interested in learning about Indigenous peoples, culture, and languages to engage in its programs, library, and collection. And with that, I will pass the mic to you.
Oh, miigwech Kaila. Bojon and Dunwe Magnaduk, Dené Indigenous Kas, Bindige Gijigo, Kwe and Diko, Namagoshan, Indo Dem, Najawananing, and Donjaba, Winnipeg Ninda, Ojibwe Anishinaabe Kwe and Dao. Migwa, Nigagwe, Nita Anishinaabe, Nui Ojibwem. Bungi etago, Nimikwenda Mag, Noko Missananiban, Gaye Nimishomasanaban, Ishkwa Ayayego Ma. I just want to acknowledge our grandmothers and grandfathers from this land who are no longer here. Je souviens au grand-mère puis mes grands-pères qui n'est pas là. I'm really happy to be here today. So I always like to start and introduce myself in the language first and really appreciate and acknowledge my esteemed colleagues who went first. I haven't seen you, Warren, in so long. And Julie, it's really nice to see you even from my screen. It's really nice to see your faces. So I'm happy to be here. My name's Dené Sinclair. I am a part of the team at MICEC, and also just want to acknowledge our original presenter was supposed to be the brilliant Anna Peranto, and Anna had a baby just a few days ago, if you know her, about 5 weeks early. So everyone's good and well, and Anna is home with baby. So I got called up to help out today. So I'm going to share a little bit about MICEC. I've prepared a few slides because I do believe that the center is one of the gems in the city that not a lot of people know about, including myself before I really started working with the team there. So to situate ourselves, MICEC is located in North Point Douglas. It's right downtown, very close walking distance to a number of other heritage organizations in the neighborhood. And we're also a heritage building, so a little bit that people are always interested in the building. It's a significant and important location in North Point Douglas and has been for over 100 years. From 1908 to 1978, it was home to the All Peoples Mission, which was a community organization, of course, supporting the multicultural foundations of Winnipeg, which really were born in North Point Douglas. MICEC was gifted the building from the United Church in 1978, and you can see in the top left there our humble beginnings. And I think probably most Indigenous people in the city, at least myself, I have lots of memories of coming to this building as a child for if your parents were involved in activism, like some of our parents were. I certainly remember coming to meetings at this building, realizing now some of the significant work that was being done through the 70s and 80s in this building. So this building does have a lot of stories to tell as it relates to the origins and political foundations of where we are today in Manitoba. So the bottom left there was some renovation work that was done on the exterior of the building in 2004. And as you can see, the interior was pretty much looked like office building and library location as it was throughout the 80s, 90s, and even into the 2000s. So in 2010 and 11, a significant renovation project took place at MICEC, and in 2011, the center was actually awarded a Heritage Winnipeg Preservation Award through Heritage Winnipeg. So I want to acknowledge Cindy and the great work happening at Heritage Winnipeg. The building was actually lowered to street level, as you can tell on the left-hand side. And for those who haven't been, we're not open to the public right now because of the pandemic, but I do expect we will be hopefully in the coming months. And I do encourage you to come to the building. It is a magnificent, beautiful location that really was born out of love and really showcases the collection in the library really quite well. So I'm really thankful for Warren starting us off on the page that he did when he talked about tangible and intangible heritage, because that's a bit on how I wanted to talk about what it is that MICEC does. And similar to what Julie talked about in her important work working in colonial institutions, MICEC is really an Indigenous community organization that still has to do some of this work within its own framework. So there's three things that I like to say to people that want to know about the center. We really do community programming. So the first of that, it's workshops, lectures, classes. I myself was teaching Ojibwe 45 minutes ago and hopped off that to come over here. All of our programs are generally online right now, but it's been a challenging transition, certainly, to try to do the kind of depth and breadth of programming that we're familiar with. But we're trying to move more online and certainly are expanding our audience as a result. The second reason why lots of people know us is because we have what's called the People's Library. So back in the 1970s, the Manitoba Indian Brotherhood, which is now the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, had a significant collection of objects, but books as well. And related to that, they realized that libraries and other institutions were not servicing the needs of researchers and Indigenous people that wanted to find literature related to their own histories. So it's a unique resource library that's built solely around Indigenous peoples, cultures, histories, languages. We really have a Manitoba focus, and we're constantly sort of curating new documents and new books to add to that, but we do have a significant historical collection as well. And the other interesting thing for library people who may be watching, our librarian, Anna Paranto, has created our own indexing system based on Indigenous knowledges. And so for library people and library science people, we actually have researchers that come to visit our library just to learn about how it is that Anna created that. The third element of the cultural center is what we call our heritage collection. So that is some of the other built heritage that we have, including artifacts, includes archaeology, artwork, clothing, medicines. And the other interesting thing about this is that it's constantly being added to. This isn't a historical collection. This is ongoing and changing as it goes. I myself have contributed things. We have our community programmings that are regularly contributing things to the heritage collection. And then the other thing is that it also includes significant audio and video recordings pertaining to Manitoba events. And that's been a big project throughout the pandemic is we are just digitizing everything that we can digitize right now because we're still close to the public, as I'm sure many places are. So as Kaila mentioned, we welcome anyone interested in Indigenous peoples, cultures, and languages. And that I did want to touch on that this is not just a historical building. We are constantly doing new programs and celebrating both traditional and contemporary skills. So it's not just about skills that were done 100 years ago. We're also interested in cool digital art that's happening these days, and all the kinds of rebirth and changing and ongoing work that's happening in our communities as it comes to cultural expression and language. So I couldn't let it go by. I think I have 2 minutes, Kaila. I couldn't let it go by without talking about the future. And I had to touch on this really briefly because we're just about to launch. This is like a sneaky preview. We're just about to launch a capital campaign because we have a significant expansion project. So this is the size of our cultural center right now, is that tiny little corner right there. And we're planning to grow more than quadruple our space, including outdoor learning space. So there's a significant demand on our space right now. You can see on the left, back in 2019, when we all could crowd into a room together. It's like a million years ago now, but we could sit together and learn together language. This is artists that came in and we're doing an artist talk. You can see our limitations of our space, and we're really planning to grow the building a lot so that we can have more community space for classes, artist presentations, community events, and things like that. And then also our collection and library are bursting at the seams. So as many places, as soon as you have a collection, it seems to grow on its own. So we currently have a library on our mezzanine level or the second floor of our building, and we really want to make it more accessible by expanding our library into the main floor of our space as well. And so we also need additional space for our collections. So that's just a little bit about MICEC. I think it's one of the most beautiful places in Winnipeg, and I'm honored and humbled to be able to work there with the amazing people that work there. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dené, for that. I will say whenever we get requests for presentations that are more about culture rather than residential schools, the MICEC is always where I direct them. And same when it comes to information about the treaties, I always recommend going to the TRCM. We are just one piece of the puzzle. When it comes to education, there are all these great organizations that do fantastic work where their focus and expertise is on culture, on treaties, on things, whereas ours at the center is related to residential schools. Now with that, we are moving ahead to our last panelist. So I am going to be introducing Andrew Wolford, who is a professor of sociology and criminology at the University of Manitoba, a member of the Royal Society of Canada College, and a former president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. He is the author of This Benevolent Experiment, Indigenous Boarding Schools, Genocide and Redress in the United States and Canada. He has quite a long list, so just for time, I'm also going to jump and select a few here. So he is co-editor of Did You See Us? Reunion, Remembrance, and Reclamation at an Urban Indian Residential School about Assiniboia that just recently came out this past May. Highly recommend picking a copy of that up through U of M Press. But also he is co-editor of Canada and Colonial Genocide of 2017 and the Colonial Genocide in Indigenous North America released in 2014. Andrew is currently working on 2 community-based research projects with residential school survivors, one being Embodying Empathy, which will design, build, and test a virtual residential school to serve as a site of knowledge mobilization and empathy, and Remembering Assiniboia, which focuses on commemoration of the Assiniboia Residential School here in Winnipeg. He has most recently initiated a project on human and more than human relations within genocidal processes under the title symbiogenetic destruction. Now, with that, I'm going to pass the virtual mic to Andrew.
Thank you. It's probably a sign that I need to rename that project. Okay, so usually when I make this presentation on behalf of the Assiniboia Residential School Legacy Group, I'd have Theodore Fontaine presenting with me. Theodore passed away in May of 2021, and we all miss him dearly. But what we're doing here is very much trying to fulfill his vision for the Assiniboia Residential School site, along with the vision of several other elders and survivors who I need to mention, who have been or are currently part of this project. This includes Dorothy Ann Crate, David Rundle, Daniel Highway, Joe Malcolm, Caroline Perot, and more recently, Betty Ross and Mabel Horton. So we're very thankful for the hard work they put in to help us, try to reclaim this part of history here in Winnipeg. Many of you will know the Assiniboia Residential School operated between 1958 and 1973. Up until 1967, it was a residential school in the sense that it both did classes and housing at the same site. After 1967 until 1973, it was a hostel from which Indigenous youth were sent to other high schools in the city. It's located in the River Heights neighborhood along Academy Road, as you can see from the photo here. And the building had a previous life as a veterans home, as well as a children's home from 1915 to 1945. About 800 students passed through its doors from 80 different communities, mostly in Manitoba, but also from Saskatchewan. Students also came from Saskatchewan and Ontario to be at the school. It was run by the Oblates of Mary Immaculate until 1969 when the federal government took it over. It has a really unique history, which I won't get into, but if you do pick up the book or have had a chance to read it, you'll see that it's not necessarily like other residential schools, given its later era that it operated in, given that it was focused mostly on high school students, that it was located in an urban situation. It did have instances of the violence and sexual violence that happened at other residential schools. But students definitely often express their feelings about the school differently than they do about their previous residential schools. That is not to say it wasn't part of an assimilative system that sought to address this question of the so-called Indian problem of trying to erase Indigenous cultures, as it was part of this movement to train leaders who, as you see in this Indian Record article, are there to go back into their communities and to try to bring Western ways into their communities. Quickly moving into how our project started, Kaila mentioned the two projects I'm working on, Embodying Empathy and Remembering Assiniboia. And the Assiniboia project actually grew out of the Embodying Empathy project. We were meeting with a group of survivors who were partnering with us to create a virtual reality residential school. And many members of the group had also attended Assiniboia after they had left their previous school, which was a Fort Alexander Indian residential school. And what they often said to us was that no one knows about Assiniboia, and no one in Winnipeg knows that Assiniboia was right here within the city. So in the spirit of relational accountability, we thought it appropriate to take their leadership and to build a new project based upon something they identified as a problem that they wanted to address. So we sought funding from the Manitoba Research Alliance, who kindly gave us funding with no real strings attached, meaning that they let us say, we want to do a project, but we want the survivors to define all of its outcomes, how it'll take place, everything that we're going to do from whatever strategies we take to research. If we're going to call it research at all, we want them to guide it entirely. And they gave us those funds so that we could meet with a group of Assiniboia survivors. And what they told us was that they wanted a reunion. They had hosted smaller reunions prior to this time, but they had had trouble reaching the broader former classmates, the survivors of the school. So they wanted a bigger reunion, they wanted a commemorative marker on the site, and they wanted the book. So the reunion was the first thing we tackled, organizing a reunion for 2017 in June. June was significant because that was often the time that the survivors were leaving school and going home. So it was seen as a happier time. So we organized it for June 2017 and had incredible support from the community, from businesses, from churches, from everyone and anyone who we asked for help. We generally got that help and support, which was wonderful. So over 2 days, the survivors provided tours of the former building. I'll just skip ahead a few slides here. You can see a few of the survivors who are there in the former classrooms building, giving tours to students and other people who came by. We had a tea, a dinner, dance. There was an outdoor function with speeches and performers. As well, we invited survivors to speak to a couple research assistants we had hired and to tell them anything they wanted, any remembrance they had of Assiniboia that they wanted to share, which eventually became the chapters for the book. Also, I'm going to skip ahead here because I know I'm going to run out of time and just get to what we're working on now. Also at the event, we presented an initial drawing by architect Herbert Enns for a commemorative site. At that point, we weren't sure what land we were going to be able to access for the commemorative site, but we had some initial drawings that we were able to consult with the survivors who attended the reunion on. Around that time, though, we found out the RCMP was selling their forensics lab, which sat where the dormitories building once sat on the campus site. And so we wrote a letter to the RCMP requesting that they hold aside a small parcel of land along Academy Road for a commemorative marker, which they said yes to right away. There was no negotiation needed. So that land has been held aside and has now finally been approved to be transferred to the city on our behalf, so that the city will be able to provide some maintenance for the site. And we're currently working with the Indigenous management group, as well as the city, many levels of government, and many other parties to start work, hopefully break ground on this commemoration site in the spring of 2022. So with the land transfer, we've begun working very hard on envisioning this site, which in the more recent drawings that Herb has prepared in consultation with the survivors, features these 30 markers, each pointing back towards the communities from which Indigenous young people were sent to Assiniboia. And on those markers, there'll be etched both the Indigenous name and the English name of the community from which they were sent. In the circle, there's a fire bowl, as well as benches that will be made from a few trees that are dying that are on the current site. So we're going to repurpose those as benches. And then there'll be a brick platform instead of the wood platform you see here, a brick platform that will have the names of the 800 plus survivors who attended this school. There'll also be native grasses surrounding the site, information panels in English, Cree, and Anishinaabe, sorry about my pronunciation, as well as a replica of the original Assiniboia residential school site. So again, it's a complex process with Assiniboia. The former campus was owned by 3 different parties. You had the playing fields out back along Wellington Crescent that are owned by the city, that are city property. Those are currently called Wellington Park. We've put in a proposal that the name be changed to Theodore Nizote Fontaine Park. And that's been going through the Welcoming Winnipeg process, and we're hoping for a positive response to that in the not too distant future. Then the former classrooms building, and now what was the former dormitories building, the site where the former dormitories building, are owned by Caspian Construction. And so far they've been very receptive to our requests and are even offering to help with maintenance of the site. So things seem to be working positively in terms of ensuring that we're able to preserve and commemorate on the site, although the group has larger plans where they would like to see more done with that park in terms of expanding the commemorative space and expanding the space for Indigenous gatherings within the city. I've skipped over a bunch of stuff trying to keep within 10 minutes, so I will leave the rest to questions because I see we only have 9 minutes left for question period, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Andrew. Everyone was pretty good on staying on time. This is fantastic. Now that we've wrapped up the panel, it's time to open up the room for questions. So I'll be looking at the chat function here as well as the Q&A function if anyone would like to submit a question to our panelists. I'll give it a few seconds, but if not, I have some questions of my own. All right, we have one question came in. Was a public art call made for the marker, Andrew?
I'm not muted. Okay, no, it wasn't. Herb started working with us very early as a volunteer and formed a close relationship with the group. So they felt very comfortable with him. Since then, Darren McGinty, who's an Indigenous architect, has joined Herb in helping with some of the design for the site.
I don't see any additional questions come in, but Julia has put a number of links into the chat for events coming up. It's the Métis Kitchen Table Teaching. So she put 2 links in the chat if you would like to take a look at them. And I guess since we do have time, I will pose this question to all of our panelists. So in general, what do you think is the biggest challenge that exists to your particular line of work in preserving Indigenous heritage and stories and language? And I don't know if we want to kind of start with the beginning with Warren and then kind of rotate around.
Maybe there's a question in the chat for me. Maybe if I
Sure.
could just
Yes.
that. So absolutely, we always compensate knowledge keepers for their time. That's extremely important element of my work. So what I'll do is I'll approach them and tell them about the project and then offer them tobacco. And if they accept, and if it's something that they want to be a part of, then they'll accept the tobacco. And then at the time when they come and they're involved in the project, then I will give them an honorarium. And there's also gifts. So the gifts are things like pickerel or deer that my family has harvested. And of course, the honorarium to compensate them for their time, the work that it takes, the emotional labor, the transportation, everything involved with that.
And then a second question related to the Métis Kitchen Teachings. Can it be viewed afterwards if they miss the original screening?
Yeah, it'll be on YouTube after.
Perfect. Just checking the Q&A again. I don't see any questions come up and nothing has come through the chat. So we are, I guess, 5 minutes out, which is a little bit of short time to answer such a big question. Let's take a look. I suppose a really nice, quick, easy one. Do you have any recommendations of other items, podcasts, films, music that you would recommend individuals to check out?
I could just jump in here and just say that one of the great resources of oral storytelling that Omushkigo elder Louis Bird has created through a partnership at University of Winnipeg is a website called ourvoices.ca. This is a wonderful collection of Omushkigo stories that I highly recommend that everyone just check it out. Some of them are in English, others are in Cree, some are translated. And it's just wonderful stories. And Louis is an incredible entertainer, so I highly recommend that.
I'll hop in, Kaila. So one of the things that MICEC does do that I didn't mention is that we do publish educational resources. So if anyone's looking for children's books or language learning resources, there's a number of them available for sale on our website. Everything from the world famous Bugadeo Dopanan, fart game, learning how to translate Ojibwe verbs into English, and appreciate that Julie brought up the idiosyncrasies of learning as being a second language learner and understanding the differences in that Ojibwe and most Algonquin languages are all verb based. So everything is action based as opposed to English, which is all noun based and centered around a person or a place or a thing. Ojibwe is less concerned about who the person, place, or thing is, but more concerned about what it is that they're doing. So if you want to learn how to fart in Ojibwe, we have a really great game that you can buy and play with your kids or your family. And that's super fun. We also have lots of other language resources. And Michelle asked a question. Our library is not open right now, but if you have a specific question, you can call the office and speak with our library techs. And if it's easy enough for them to even scan and send you what you're looking for, they are doing that right now. So, miigwech.
I have one resource that maybe I'll recommend. Dr. Chantel Fiola. She is a professor at the University of Winnipeg. She just published a book called Returning to Ceremony. It's a second book, and let me just put it in the chat here. I'll link to it. It's about misconceptions about Métis, the Métis Nation, and spirituality and Catholicism. So I'll just put the link there for everyone.
And sorry, you've already promoted Did You See Us for us, so I don't have to promote that one. But two members of the Assiniboia Residential School Legacy Group board have also had their memoirs published. Theodore Fontaine's Broken Circle is back on the McNally bestseller list recently, thanks to Thin Air Festival. And Betty Ross's story is partially covered through David Robertson's graphic novel, Sugar Falls. So recommend those both highly.
Now, we did have some questions come through the Q&A. The first one I think maybe will be directed at Warren. So thinking about intangible versus vitalization, for example, knitting is an intangible knowledge, but creates something tangible. Is vitalization being applied throughout the industry?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good question. And I think, we've actually seen in, I think, all the presentations today, examples of how the the tangible and the intangible being melded together within Indigenous contexts, so that and even to take the NCTR also for a great example, where it's an archive of the stories, but it's also a mandate is to generate discussion and generate further stories to be told, right? So I think that is sort of something that applies in other contexts as well. So I think knitting is an interesting example. Traditions come from the past, we create something new, then that's passed on and something new is created. So it can happen through material media like that. For me, what I'm most interested in is how it happens through the voice and through the listening, but it definitely can happen in other ways as well. So yeah, thanks, good question.
And then the next two, I'm going to tie them together. Julia, this would be for you. And it's when renaming former pieces, are the old names recorded or archived in some way? Is that kept privately? And does renaming also apply to current or new works that may come up?
Yeah, so in the provenance of each artwork, which is like the history of the artwork, all of the old names are kept there. So they will be recorded in the provenance of the artwork, the old titles. Something that was really important to me as well was that when we have the new titles on the panel or the small label, that it has the knowledge keeper that gave that name or gifted that name to the piece, so that their work is acknowledged too, along with that work, with the artwork. What was the second part of that question?
And when it comes to new pieces that are accessioned, would new naming be applied as well if there's some sort of challenge in that way?
Yeah, they definitely would be. We'll be doing like a phase 2 and phase 3 of this project moving forward, because there were a few nuances that came up during the project that we hadn't foreseen, and there was no like template to follow in terms of project management, how to do it. So we sort of made it up as we went. So we'll be following up with a second and third phase. And I saw a question earlier about an exhibition of the artworks. We're exploring that currently, about telling the story of this project and potentially having it travel to different institutions on Turtle Island. So it's something we're exploring right now. We just freshly finished it, and we have to sort of decide what the next phase will be.
Perfect. Then we had one last question, which Dené answered, but I'll just announce it all. The question was, how can we support the capital campaign for the Education Center? There's a donate button on their website, and this winter they're going to be having a fundraiser. So with that, we're 2 minutes over. I think we did fantastic when it comes to time and questions. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us here today. And I guess I have to pass the mic back to our Manitoba Heritage, our mouth harp host. And with that, thanks again for joining us.
Bonjour. Yes, I am the mouth harp guy host. My name's Rob. Kaila, you did an amazing job. Bravo to all the panelists. That was fascinating and extremely instructive. And yeah, wonderful job. Great example to be followed by everybody else. Now, we're not done, but we've still got a lot of programming, but it does mean that we need to take a breath. So I'm going to invite everybody at home, just take a deep breath. Close your eyes while you're doing it, just to give your eyes a break. Resettle, because we're going to get ready for our next panel.